much for having me, and we're here to talk about effective communication. And so in doing that, we're going to try and be a little bit effective by recording for those who were unable to be here. And where I started is I just really wanted to frame what we're doing and then make some points afterwards. Often when I do this, in fact, if we had more people, I'd probably get up and draw it on the whiteboard as I go, but I've got a little picture here. Many of you will have heard of Joseph Campbell. He wrote a book back in 1946 called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And a lot of people have been talking about him more recently because there's been kind of this aha moment that maybe Campbell's work is more than just about mythology. So Campbell wrote about how every story, basically there is only one story that people are interested in. We've got one version of our journey, and really we just change the context. So in the context of what you guys have been doing, probably less of you here today and more of you on the recording, there was something that set you off on a journey. So if we think of you as the hero or the heroine, depending on the context, you didn't just show up one day and start going through this journey. There was some kind of spark, some kind of call to action. Now, whether that was somebody bashing you over the head and say, you really need to do something about X, or whether it was some yearning in yourself, there was something that made you take action. And so I'm talking about this in the big picture of your journey through the mentoring program, but in that spark could be just today. With what I'd really like you to do is just think about where it is that you'd like to be more effective in your communication. Like, what has sparked you to find this session of particular interest? And I say that with a smile on my face because we do have a very low tone at it. So maybe that spark is not great. So, but if you think about any story, have I got like Star Wars fans in the room? You know, if you think about Luke Skywalker as a baby, little Luke, there was an event that sparked this epic journey of his, that somebody showing up unexpectedly that sparked his interest in something that had been dwelling in him for a while. Harry Potter, under the stairs, an owl arrives with a letter. There's some spark that starts off the journey, whether it's metaphorically or in our lives. And I think sometimes just standing back and thinking about, well, what is that spark, actually can remind us where we're going. So then what happens when you go on the journey? You collect your people and your tools. Luke Skywalker, he got a couple of robots and a jet fighter. Harry Potter got a giant, a squashed birthday cake, and a train ride to a new place. Think about yourself, what you've collected with part of your journey. Now, it doesn't have to be this journey, but you do. You collect your people and you collect your tools. But it's only when you've got those things that you can make your dive into the unknown. So effectively, in this particular journey, now I've got a couple of drawings there. Two of them are the ones that are kind of special to me when I think about communication. One of them there is, it's labelled your people, so clearly, hopefully you can see what that is. But what I've tried to do is indicate there that what I think is really valuable in a journey towards having an effective communication plan is that those people have to be different from you. There has to be some kind of diversity. And the reason for that, when we'll explore this as we go on, but communication is, the expression I use is, communication is what the listener does. So if I'm talking to somebody who's exactly like me, or possibly even worse, because there is no one exactly like me, just as there's no one exactly like you, if I'm just talking to myself, if I'm just structuring and thinking about the communication in my head and in my world, or on my email screen, or on my text message, the only input I'm getting is me. Now that could be brilliant, or it could be crap. I will never know. But a diversity of communication styles and a diversity of people to talk to will help you hone your communication skills. But also in this larger mentoring picture, if everybody was exactly the same, there would be no benefit to it. that actually part of the strength of a mentoring program or any kind of growth program is looking for where the differences are. Looking for how you're different, looking how somebody else is different, and drawing on both the strengths and the weaknesses of that process. The other one is a tool, Yes And, which I just want to talk about really quickly. In fact, I just want to have a go. Actually, can I have a volunteer? Can I have 2 volunteers? Volunteer. Oh, you volunteer as well. You guys don't know each other very well, do you? Not at all? Okay. So what I would like you to do is take turns talking to each other. And, you know, for you at home, try this with somebody. You're going to take turns. What I'd like you to do is, firstly, I want you to make a plan to go out tonight, okay? Even though you've just met, you're going to make a plan to go out tonight. Now, either of you can start, it doesn't matter. But whatever you answer, the person has to answer, the sentence needs to start with yes, but. Okay, so I want you to start with a suggestion, and the answer has to be yes, but, go on. Then you will say yes, but, and go on. Let's just see how far you can make that conversation work. So
do you want to go out in the city tonight?
Yes, but I don't have a my key.
That's okay.
Sorry. Yes, but.
Yes, but.
You're already stopped.
Yes,
right?
but.
There's nowhere you can go.
Yes, but we can drive.
Yes, but I don't have a car.
Yes, but I do.
Yes, but I have an irrational fear of getting in cars.
I think the point's made. You are the worst person to pick for a yes, but, because it is clearly not that is not what drives you. In business, though, we hear yes, but all the time. You know, and somebody said to me the other day, yes, however, is just a but dressed up in fancy clothes. However, and we hear that all the time. People are saying yes to us, or we're saying yes to somebody else, but it's conditional. Try the same conversation, but instead of yes, but, yes, and. So start again, exactly the way you did, and next time you'll have to say yes, and. That's why your sentence goes.
So, would you like to go out in the city tonight?
Yes, and perhaps I could buy a my key.
Yes, and we can get some food while we're buying that my key.
Yes, and maybe instead we could even drive.
Yes, and I've got a car, so that's a good idea.
Yes, and this will give me a chance to get over my irrational fear of cars.
Beautifully done. The point, I hope, is made that by opening ourselves up to having yes and conversations, that could have actually gone in a completely different way. Like, I think you really made it enjoyable for all of us by trying to keep it as close as you possibly could.
It was more positive.
It's completely positive.
By saying and instead of but, it's like a totally different conversation.
It's a totally different conversation, and it's an open conversation. It's an open conversation where both of you can contribute ideas and both of you can refine those ideas. So that's one tool. Good. There are lots of tools you already have. Like, let's face it, you've got tools for conversation. You're here. You've shown up as part of that process, whether that's here virtually or here in the room. You have language. You have the ability to look people in the eye. You have written language too, I assume, because communication isn't just our voices. So you have a whole heap of tools. The question is, how then do you make the best use of the tools that you have? So again, just going on with my metaphor from Joseph Campbell, the next part is to dive into the unknown. Now, these two have already done that a little bit. They've been a little bit trusting, and they've dived in to have a go at using a tool that they hadn't played with before, but also to just trust that there is some benefit in going through this process. In the mentoring sense, I'm sure all of you have had to dive into the unknown at some point. That you've had to trust that your mentor is on your side, because we can have positional trust. We understand that this person has signed up to do that for us, but until we've actually had that exchange, we don't know. But you can't find out unless you dive into the unknown. So again, I'll use Harry Potter. He went through that wall at station 9 3/4. He dived into the unknown and immediately started forward on his journey. And most of the big stories, most of the heroic stories, most of the stories that we care about head off in that direction. But by the time we get anywhere, what Brené Brown and Pixar call Act 2, we get to the point where we're in the pit of despair. Now, so the pit of despair, Campbell called that. Campbell, by the way, consulted on the first Star Wars movie. So there's a scene in the Star Wars, one of the first Star Wars movies, where Yoda says to Luke, "You have to go into that cave," and he's saying, "Well, why do I have to go? I'm scared." And Yoda says in Yodish, and I don't purport to be able to do it, the cave that you fear is the cave you must enter. And we know this ourselves, isn't it? We do need to do stuff that challenges us in order to grow. We can get into the terror zone. That's Murray Burgess, who I know you guys have worked with. She uses that language, in the terror zone. And then you're immobilised, you can't go anywhere. But if you can get out of your comfort zone and practice doing things that you're less comfortable with. So now I'm going to guess, like one of the things, a communication style that I know I'm not particularly comfortable with, and I'm guessing Aileen isn't comfortable with, is the pause and the silence.
Didn't let you pause there.
Now, and that actually, when we think about communication, we've got to think about not just how we speak, but how we listen to other people and how we open up time. Let me tell you a story about how I learned. For me, the pause is still one of the hardest things for me to do, because I do like, firstly, I clearly love the sound of my own voice. Listen to how we're still on slide 1. Clearly, but I'm joking there. Clearly, I want to communicate what I hope are some really interesting things that I'm really excited about. And this is the kind of meeting where the job is for me to communicate something, to impart some information. But I work as a lawyer. I spend a lot of time negotiating. So when I was pregnant with my second son, I was doing a deal where the other side were based in Florida, so the time difference was absolutely terrible. And we were at this really late juncture, and we really needed to close this deal by the end of April, which was a financial new year in, I think that was for London that needed that. So we've got this 3-way telephone call, and we've got to try and close this deal. My son was born on the 23rd of April, so I can tell you it was the 22nd of April. And it's sort of dragging on, and I went into labour. And so the only way that I really could effectively deal with that this is 19 years ago, mind you, I could deal with that on the phone was to just hit the mute button and hold my breath a little bit when the contractions hit. Now I suddenly realised, now this is as much a story about how working in law is a really terrible profession, but I also needed to know, I needed to close. I'm also a finisher. I like things to be done before I move on to the next job. And to be fair, it was pretty stupid of myself to be in that position, because my son's due date was the 23rd of April. Like there was a high likelihood that he would be born pretty soon. But I learned this, it was really interesting, because where normally in my facilitation style, as soon as things went quiet, I would be saying, "So, what do you think of this?" And blah, like, "I know that you've got this interest. Could we talk about blah, blah, blah?" My silences meant there were long silences on the phone.
Contraction silences.
Yes, the contractions that were in fact not contractions, they were elongations of the conversation in some way. Now, can I tell the story because it's funny, and also humour is a good way for many of us to communicate and to emphasise a point. But I really did learn in that moment that actually the earth doesn't disappear if I don't talk when it's completely silent. That there are plenty of people who are actually quite comfortable, in fact more comfortable knowing that everybody else has finished what they've said and that they can take a deep breath before they start. So again, one of the things, I had to literally dive into the pit of despair. this is on a recording. I really hope my son doesn't think that his birth was the pit of despair. But I had to go into a place that I felt very uncomfortable in order to learn that it's okay to stop, and that sometimes communication is in the stopping. So that's a good example. Now we haven't got a lot of time. We've got 2 hours, and I've picked out some particular type of communication skills to sort of whet your interest, and then provide you with some reading at the end, so that if there's something that you think, yeah, this is a tool that I think I need to know more about, you've got some avenues for getting in there. But it's actually only when we come out of that pit of despair and we can return back with this new toolkit, my somewhat strange Swiss Army knife, that we return back from our voyage. And it's really interesting, most heroes return to the place they started. And I think actually in this, if we think about popular culture, at the end of every Harry Potter book, he goes back home. But he comes back with skills, with tools and approaches to the world that he never had. So the great hero's journey, the journey of Odysseus, so the Odyssey, he travels around and ends up back where he started. But where he started is now a new normal.
We found that a lot with the mentoring. The mentee becomes mentor.
Exactly. So you're still, now for some people going through a mentoring program they do that because they want to end up with change. Whether that often they'll go in with the thought, I want a new job, a different job. But actually going through a program like this often allows you to return to your normal with a new set of skills, a new set of ways of looking at the world, which give you a clarity around, actually, my normal might be okay if I can talk to people in a different way, or possibly more importantly, if they will listen to me in a different way. Usually when you gather new skills, needing to leave where you start is because people around you haven't changed, and that they can't listen to the new normal of you. It's actually, change in my view, and I know in Aileen's view, should be a constant. If you're not changing, you're not participating in your life. And so a new normal, it's still okay to come back to the beginning. And actually the reason I draw this as a circle, because your journey just keeps starting again. And some journeys happen in an hour, some journeys happen over a decade, some happen over weeks. Journeys overlap in this sense. And I just think it's a really great metaphor to come back to. So I'm a big fan of Brené Brown's work, which a number of you will have seen. And so she, through her work with Pixar, she talks about this a lot. It's the only thing I don't really like about her is because I was doing this hero's journey stuff way before I read about her doing it. She's given me insights to it. But it's this, I think it's a really great thing. So one of the things that Brené Brown talks about, an insight she's given me, is she says, well, you can't skip the second act. Actually, if it's not hard and uncomfortable, you can't actually come back any different or changed. So we were talking a bit before we started about running. One of the things that I've learnt from this kind of thing in my running is actually sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable. You're not going to love it every time you do it, but you can't do a marathon if you don't do lots of 10K runs or 15K runs or half marathons. So again, this analogy. That was just supposed to be my quick introduction. Yeah. By the way, especially with this setting, let's talk as we go rather than have questions at the end. So,
do you agree with when you jump in the pit of despair that you have to constantly practice to get good at it? Like if the pause, for example.
The pause. Yeah, I think it is.
If you want to get good at the pause, you have to constantly practice it.
Yeah, practice makes permanent.
Yeah.
Doesn't make perfect.
Absolutely. As I then took a deep breath and counted in my head for a second to be really sure that you'd finished. Yes, I have to practice, and I will do that all the time. But there are lots of different things like that. The other thing I agree with is won't always work. sometimes that's the thing about taking risks. That's why you get high rewards when you take risks, is because every time you take a risk, you actually risk failure. And that's actually the stuff, the Brené Brown stuff, that I find the most rewarding reading is the book that, the name of it's going to escape me, but where she does the research on the people who have been through terrible situations. And the ones who are good at that have usually failed. So what she says is, well, failure isn't an option. You will fail. It will be hard. There are days that you will set out to try and do something and you will just not succeed. So actually what makes you brave is the fact that you go back and you try again. And that's often the stuff that we have to work on. No, I am actually here. So the other thing, again, lawyer, out and proud. Sorry, we like definitions. Is there no clicker? Am I supposed to stand behind a podium? That was never going to happen. I won't sit here for very long though, so I'll tell you. So effective. So the topic I was given today was effective communication. And I think actually we go often, as particularly because we're in a rush, we go to communication. We think, okay, we're going to talk about communication. But I think the most important word in that sentence, effective communication, is effective. And one of the things, my observation, I'm happy for you to tell me that you don't approach the world like this, but the thing that I see most often when a conversation or a communication is ineffective is that at least one person didn't go into the conversation with some sense of what they wanted the effect of that conversation to be.
Yeah.
Now, effective is different from planned outcome. Again, communication is a two-way thing. Even if you are just imparting information, you need somebody to take on that information. And for it to be effective, for you to be successful in producing the desired or intended result of communicating that piece of information to somebody else, that person has to be prepared to listen to you. Has any of you ever had a conversation with a 3-year-old trying to get them to do something that they don't want to do, or seen that play out? Everybody's been in a supermarket where you've sat there and silently judged the woman who is dealing with, and they're always women in this situation. I don't know how men get away with it. Who's the 2 or 3-year-olds who've thrown themselves down on the floor, and all you're trying to do is get them to leave or calm down or whatever. 3-year-olds are really effective at ensuring that communications they don't want to get are not going to get through. They will literally throw everything in it. This is how, dealing in a very male-oriented world for much of my career, I would often sit there looking at somebody who's clearly not paying any attention to the message that I'm trying to send through and think, I've dealt with a 3-year-old, your iPhone is nothing. The fact you're just tuning out of this is absolutely nothing. So again, and my hint here is that you can be too planned if you are really set on what the outcome, particularly of a conversation or a negotiation, will be, and that there is only one destination that you are going to be happy with. In fact, it can be very hard for you to be open to a full conversation. But for you to actually spend, particularly on important communications, to spend a moment and think, what does effective look like? What effect am I trying to cause here? What effect will we be able to see in the past when this conversation is over, if this is worked the right way, can really inform you as you walk into your conversation. Can also inform you to think about, well, what the medium for your communication should be. Is this something I need to put in writing? Is this something that would be better said face to face? Is this something I can deal with in a text message? Is a phone call more appropriate? And sometimes too, if we're thinking about it in the bigger picture of what do I want my effective relationship with this person to be, then we can also need to reflect on what other communications we've had with someone. Someday I'm going to turn it into a mathematical algorithm, but I am absolutely convinced that there is a formula for every relationship that I have. So Aileen and I have known each other for about 8, feels like longer, I feel like I've known you forever, about 8 years. I really enjoy Aileen's company. I will have many interactions with her in every year, but when I say many, probably let's call it 20. In a year, we would probably have some kind of interaction or communication 20 times, like 20 nodules of communications. I would suggest that it's probably about 5 of those might be a text message or an email or something, some kind of informational exchange. Then this is also, it's because it's Aileen and I and our communication styles and the way that we get along, I would say probably there will be another 5 to 10 that would be telephone calls. But it's like one will send an email and the other one will just pick up the phone.
I don't think I've ever sent an email.
No, well then I will send an email and she'll pick up the phone.
Every time.
Or
yeah, it's my preferred.
yes, and that's how, well that's her preferred methodology and all the rest of it. But then I know that if I have had 5 telephone calls with Aileen, is my rough guess, that I will need to meet her for a cup of coffee. Mm-hmm. That's actually how to keep our relationship authentic, or we meet here. We'll have a face-to-face meeting.
Yeah, that's true.
Many of you will work in environments where you talk to somebody 20 times or communicate with somebody 20 times a day. I've sat in law firms where I've had hundreds of communications with people, 3 offices down, and they've all been by email. Again, the formula depends. Now, I'm the person who will get out of my chair, I'll get that email and I'll go and have a look. I also, people who get to know me know that I only read emails like twice a day, so if they really need me, I'm the same with text messages, if they really need me, they're going to have to ring me. Or I think of email as a gift of something that somebody sent you, this thing that clearly doesn't need to be dealt with straight away because they sent it to you by email, so you can respond to it methodically when it suits you, unless they've been quite precise about the timing. But again, there's a kind of algorithm. Effective communication means that you've got to think about who your audience is and who you get to know.
So that is a really good point, because we do all have natural styles, and you will email me and I'll always call you, and I will call you and then you'll email me. So
don't call me, that's the
that's
the takeaway.
Sometimes the medium communicates something as well.
Sometimes to get out of a call, there'll be a flood in their building just to get out of a call. So who owns that? Who owns that?
But that is actually about observation. It's about listening, and it's about working out, well, what's going to be the most effective thing. And there is no one size fits all.
Yeah.
There is no. Now, I sort of joke about I'm going to get an algorithm, but I know one of the variables will need to be the participants.
Yeah.
Who the participants are and what their communication styles are. Now, I know with my own style, there will be certain things with particular people, and particularly working in a legal environment where you're sending often serious and weighty things to people. Yeah. I will quite often, before I send something, I will make a telephone call that says, okay, I'm going to send you this. I don't want to talk about it right now because I think you need to consider it, and I would prefer you didn't get back to me for a couple of days because you need to consider it deeply, and let's face it, you're going to fly off the handle. You are not going to be happy with what I have to say. Yeah. And I know I will do that with certain clients and certain people that I work with. With others, I'll send the email first and call straight away. Others I'll call, and I won't follow up with paper until we've kind of negotiated, because an effective communication to get an outcome in that particular context, particularly in a legal context, might mean negotiating something, because your immediate contact is not the only audience for that written document. Yeah. Sometimes the writing can be problematic. It can set things in train you otherwise wouldn't have wanted. And we all know that from getting a shouty cat's text message every now and then, that how we can just because somebody wrote it doesn't mean the way we read it is the same.
Yeah. I was just thinking too, we've talked about, because the guys have completed their disc profiles, we've talked about the timing of the day to have that conversation too, which is going to be different for an extrovert than it would be for someone who has a preference for introversion. So if the focus is effective, and you ask yourself the question, is now an effective time to call?
Yeah.
Is this an effective medium to use? That's going to be more effective.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start emailing you guys.
No, you can call. It's okay.
Oh, sorry, I should turn that off. So, moving on to the next one. So, as some of you know from my background, I use and teach a lot of design thinking. So, design thinking is sort of somewhere between a toolkit of methodologies and a process for solving complex problems. And I don't want to call any of you problems, but every human is complex. All of us portray something about ourselves on the outside. We've got our internal stuff that's going on. Many of us have internal stuff that's going on that we don't even know about. And a tool that design thinkers use a lot is this empathy map. And it's a great way of actually thinking about all of the things that are going on in a communication. So empathy mapping is often used, it's actually came up with something that was designed originally by designers for looking at the way that people use products. So understanding what the user experience is of using a ball or wearing a pair of shoes, or some people do it with more or less empathy, especially when it comes to shoes. But I think it's a pretty easy, quick model for thinking about how in any conversation that we have, and I would suggest you think about yourself, drawing an empathy map for yourself as well as the other person can be really powerful. So think at the moment about a difficult conversation that you've had with somebody, personally or professionally, it doesn't matter. Think about the extent to which there were similarities between what you said and what you were thinking. What did you leave out of that conversation? What were you thinking that you didn't express? Or what did you express that didn't really articulate properly what you were thinking? How were your actions consistent with what you said, or even what you were thinking? How are they consistent with your values or otherwise? And then also, how are you feeling while all this was going on? How much, and what was the other person potentially feeling? You can see what the other person does. You can see if they're a little bit shaky when they pick up their glass of water. They might be a little bit more stressed than their words suggest. You don't know what they're feeling, but you can empathise. Now, empathise, particularly nowadays when design thinking has become such a buzzword, empathy is a bit overused too. And I just really want to make a point, and I know because you guys have been doing this program that you will have thought about this. We'll use this analogy. Empathy is putting yourself into somebody else's shoes, and it is. But empathy is understanding how they feel in their shoes, not what you would do if you were in their shoes. Empathy is about trying to understand what and why, as much as you can, they feel or do the things that they feel or do, not what you would feel if you were in their situation.
Yeah. And
it's a really subtle but a really important difference, because sometimes it can be really hard to get our own, to actually do that. As I looked at you looking at the screen, and yes, I can see you on the recording peering through. No, I can't. So you look at that screen, I can see a few screwed up little faces saying, okay, I know what I said, what was I thinking? How many of you had that moment where you walk out of a conversation and think, what was I thinking? And how many of you have then taken that the next step to actually really sit down and actually think, what was I thinking? Because it's one thing to say it, another thing to actually go and unpick that. And that's hard. That takes you into this pit of despair. What was I doing was similar. I was joking a bit with Aileen when I was in the car because I was running late because of traffic. And I was saying, well, one of the things, and I've got a few more slides on it as we get on, that I really wanted to focus on was if you want to be effective communicating sets of values about things that are important to you, saying them is not worth nearly as much as doing them. So one of my values is punctuality.
It is too.
Like I get anxious about people not being punctual, particularly if they're me.
So I'm so stressed today.
Well, actually, the funny thing is, when I say get anxious about it, I'm going to explain. I get anxious about it in a slightly different way from many. I used to think it was rude. Actually, I used to be quite. I'm not judgy about it. It used to be rude, and I had this client again. This is more than 20 years ago, who was a rabbi. He was a lovely man. So he would often be at least 10 minutes early for a meeting. He seemed to be early everywhere he went. But a lot of the other people in this, it was a not-for-profit, and a lot of people who were involved in it, and they were always running late. And he would sit in a room and he'd always have a book and something to do. And he would be so calm and so generous about it. And I ended up asking one day, I said, look, you are always early. Clearly, you are always early. Being on time is important to you. Yet you never seem to have a problem with that. He says, well, time is a resource. And I've always got things to do. I've always got things to read. I've always got something to do. And the way I see it, unless people are psychopaths or evil, they don't actually want to steal from you. And people who are late are stealing your time. So I know they don't want to steal it, so they must have a good reason. And I just think, it says, and I know it makes them anxious when they're late. Nobody wants to be late, but they get caught up in the things they do because time is valuable and they're using it. And they're using it in a way that's important to them.
Every time I'm late, I'm often late. Whenever I'm late, it's always related to a person, never a thing. I would leave the photocopier just jammed. I wouldn't care if it was written out 1,000, I would just leave it. But if it was a phone call, I wouldn't. So it depends on what.
Exactly. So you're spending your resource doing the things that are important to you, which means sometimes they balance out.
Yeah, but the other person is thinking, hang on, I'm the person too
yes.
that I'm late for. I say to my husband, I'm always going to be late because he's always early.
I always have something to do. But anyway, I just thought the way he put it was really beautiful at the time. So this map, one of the things that we can do from this is we sort of pull out and observe, and I'm suggesting observe ourselves as well as other people. We can start to gather information or data about what that other person needs, what we need, what's going to make our communications with this person effective. And then also, over time, we gather insights about ourselves and about the other person. And I think it's really a valuable tool for thinking about the ways that we want to communicate. So we have insights about who we need to speak to face to face. We have insights about when somebody is going to be better in a group or one-on-one. We do this by actually really observing and really the focus is, I think, on listening. I really need to dismiss that. So this next slide, which you guys will see in a minute, many of you will have heard before. Been around since the 50s, some science that says, this is a slide I added this morning that wasn't on your kit, that there is this rule, 55% of everything that we receive in a conversation or we understand about a person comes through their body language, through what we observe through our eyes. 38% of our understanding comes from the tone of voice that they use, and only 7% comes from the words themselves. Now that research has been around for a really long time. It's been debunked left, right and centre, and so a lot of, but what the scientists are saying or psychologists are saying consistently is a significant proportion of any communication is not the words that you use. So
Yeah,
you know much more about this psychology stuff than I do.
It's
so
actually something that that one of the mentees in Queensland said the other day, and it really resonated with me. I've been thinking about it a bit since she said it. But she said the psychology from a female's perspective is that when they are raising their voice, the pitch gets much higher, whereas a man will get much lower, and then that goes back to a woman's brain is attuned to the nurturer. So a child's cry they can hear because of that pitch, and that's why sometimes the woman might hear the child cry and the father may not hear the child cry. And then a man is about danger, so the hum of an engine or the growl of a dog is more attuned. And it was just really interesting to me around when a woman in hire is wanting to make a point, if they raise their voice, the pitch it goes pitchy, high pitchy, and it's not heard as well.
Oh, and the language that we hear sometimes is somebody is shrill, she's shrill.
Yeah, that's right.
Or it's annoying. And there are biological reasons for some of those things. And that's sometimes one of the reasons why we need to think about the medium. So, like just making an announcement, like a stock exchange announcement, or putting something on a notice board. Again, we know, if notice board is a really good example, we know that a big clear sign indicating danger is going to attract attention more quickly, or a flashing light or a loud sign, than the word danger. We have an alarm rather than the word danger, because the word danger is just a word. The word itself doesn't have a huge amount of impact. However, the words we use and the tone of voice is almost everything on a telephone conversation. The words we use are important. The thing is too, the words we use will be more important to some people than they will be to others. So again, the lawyers in the room have been trained specifically to pay a great deal of attention to the words. So one of the things, we use Latin. We're very fancy like that. So one of my favourite Latin expressions is re ipsa locuta. It means the words speak for themselves. In other words, we use really fancy words that the rest of you don't understand when we're going to charge you more money, because otherwise you would understand them and not want to pay us. So again, the words are, I'm being a little bit facetious, but
on the record.
But one of the reasons that we will cloud our communications in a particular way, because we are sending you a communication. You're actually paying for the letter from us, so it needs to come out. It needs to come out in a particular way. Just as for goods that you hire to your customers need to be clean or need to be presented in a particular way, in a consistent way. So another one, there's a contract rule called the Justum Generis rule. And basically what that is it's a court will assume that if you have two words that mean similar things in a document, that your intention was for them to mean different things. Because if you could use the same word to mean twice, then you would mean the same thing twice. So it's relatively logical when you think about it. So if I, for example, in the contract say, I will wash all of the shirts, but then somewhere else in the contract it deals with all of the clothes will be packaged up in a particular bundle, then I produce shirts that are bundled and washed, but dirty clothes that everything else are bundled the way they should be, but they can be dirty. You can't come back to me and say, but it says you need to wash the clothes. It doesn't. It says I need to wash the shirts. So similar but different. That was a bad example made up on the spot, but I think you understand. So again, context is key. In a contract, the words that you use need to be precise, concise, exact. But in a communication with an employee, often being too precise just immediately puts them on warning that, actually we're making a record here of some sort of conversation. Being too precise actually suggests that you've rehearsed something, which then detracts from the value of the communication. We all know, we've all done it. We've all sent the email that we regret. We've all sent a text message to the wrong person, perhaps, that we would have regretted even sending to the right person. The context is absolutely key. And so, yes, the point here is to think that any communication, the words matter, but they don't matter as much as the other things. And you need to think about the context. Actually, I've got to pay attention to the time too. I won't spend too much talking. Stay there because we're going to swap very quickly. My guess is that you will have come across this if you haven't already talked.
We haven't spoken about leaning in around this particular one. I'm sure some people may have.
So this is Sheryl Sandberg on the picture. She's written a couple of books now. One of them is called Lean In. She's based on a really popular TED talk that she did. She is the COO of Facebook, and she was previously at Google. She's been an incredibly successful person. And in a nutshell, what leaning in is about is she talks about how many women that she has worked with don't lean in. So, and she describes it roughly, and I'm completely oversimplifying him. Sheryl Sandberg. I'll give you the slides at the end, and they've got the names on it. But she says, well, what happens is she'll meet a young executive who's very keen to get some mentoring or to move up in the ranks. And that young executive will say, yeah, but at some point I need to have a baby. And they're like, okay, well, when are you having to plan a baby? Oh, well, I'm actually not married yet, but I know I'm going to want to have a baby in the future. Like, oh, well, when are you getting married? Oh, well, actually, I don't even have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, so yeah, I don't know. But, in my big plan, I'd like to have kids sometime in my 30s. So how old are you now? I'm 22. It's like, actually, if you are too busy making stopgaps in your plan because of this thing that might happen in 10 years' time, when you know nothing about what your world in 10 years' time is doing, you are actually saying no. You aren't leaning into what you're doing now. Now, it's a particular example.
Regardless if it's
women are not the only
28.
ones who don't do it. Just because you're heading for Rome doesn't mean that you can't take a little diversion along the way and spend a bit of time in Northern Africa or across to South America even. You might have your big life goals, but that doesn't mean that you say no to everything else along the way. And by leaning in, and again, one of the things that we, particularly women, have troubles with is often saying no, creating boundaries, and we'll talk about boundaries in a minute, but saying no to everything and not leaning into the things that inspire you or value you, that you value, can really slow you down. I know, again, talking to Aileen before I did this, that you'd been drawing a little bit on the Brené Brown work, and the picture here is actually from when I was reading her one of her books, and she was talking about being American. There's always an acronym, right? Going big. And she talks about boundaries, integrity, and generosity. And I actually put this in as a placeholder note because they were just actually the notes that I was taking when I was reading it, at the stuff that mattered to me, and I never actually got around to drawing it as a picture in any way that makes sense. And I'm not expecting you to be able to read here, but I find this is a really interesting idea that in order to live our big life, as she calls it, or a compassionate and empathetic life, that we need to be aware of our boundaries. We need to have integrity and we need to have generosity. And I just wanted to remind you of that because, and I'm sure these sort of three ideas and how they fit together really makes, you've talked about a lot in other senses, but in sense of having a conversation actually bringing big to a conversation, I think, is a really important thing. And it doesn't take very long to think about it. Thinking about, well, what are your own boundaries with a conversation? Again, I'll tell you a funny story about from my life. The very first time I ever went overseas on a work gig, and I was sitting up the front of a plane, first business class, next to my boss, who's a very large South African man. And I didn't know him very well. I was very excited. I'm heading off to Hong Kong. I think I was, 29 or so. I'm heading off to Hong Kong for this first time. They've given me a glass of champagne. And his name was Colin, and he says, I won't try the South African accent, but he essentially says, Cathryn, we don't know each other very well, and I think we just need to establish, there's some things I think you need to know about me. I'm South African, so I'm very blunt and I swear a lot. I like a drink, and so I do tend to, I will be drinking on this flight and probably every night. And I'm also a very touchy-feely person, and so and I just looked at him. I don't even know where this came from. I said, well, I'm Irish. Hand me a drink, and if you fucking touch me, I'll smack you. Don't think I ever swore again, but I think, actually we were able to have that conversation. We became great friends, but we had that conversation where we were able to establish what our boundaries were. He never touched me, by the way.
I'm reading the 5-second rule at the moment. Have you guys read the 5-second rule?
No.
But it's about, and you just saying that, I don't even know where that came from. It's about, don't ignore that
gut feeling.
I'm going to say this. Don't ignore it, because I'm not sure if I want to use explanatory.
But that's a really good example of you listening as well, because you knew you could swear at him.
Yeah.
You knew you could be stern. So it was you listened to what he said, and then you.
Well, and also I'm being generous, using generosity here in a very loose sense, not in the way Brené Brown intended, but I am, 2 out of 3. Yeah. We can drink and we can swear, but physical contact is not something that I am comfortable with. It was to my integrity, and now the generosity there, so what Brené Brown talks about with generosity is, and I think this is an exercise that everybody should do once in their life, is to think about the person who gives you the most trouble. In fact, you should write it down so that you go into the pit of despair. And then think about, it's a thought experiment, if you knew without any doubt that that person was doing the best that they can, the absolute best that they can, what would you do differently? And that's about bringing to every conversation the generosity of spirit that this person that I am communicating with is doing the best that they can. Now, if the best that they can be is disingenuous or manipulative or political, actually then you need to make some choices, and they might be hard choices. But coming to every conversation with the generosity and the openness of this person is bringing the best that they can right now in this moment to this event, and then sticking with your boundaries and your integrity is about as good a tool as I can think of for navigating life. So even though, and Aileen and I have had a separate talk about this, because I've been bringing a lot of Brené Brown's work into my own facilitation and my own teaching recently, there's a lot of it I don't like. I don't like an acronym. I don't like a 5-step rule. I can't imagine a world that I've ever worked in where you start a meeting with permission slips. I give myself permission to swear in this meeting. It's not going to work, right? But there are lots of the work, and she's done deep research into what makes people able to get up and keep going when things are tough, and being clear on their boundaries, working to their values, and being generous. It's all 3 of them. You can't have 2 and make it work. And so I think it's really, really worthwhile work. So this was, as I said, I really wanted to talk about this idea of practicing what we preach. I'm going to ask you to, if I move now, I'm going to lose power. So you don't know what we're going through for you on the other side of this screen. So again, as I said, it's on the slide. If punctuality is important to you, be on time. If you want to set rules about using your phone in meetings, don't look at your phone in a meeting. And I think, again, this is everything I know about effective communication workplace environment. I've learnt from managing toddlers at some point, you need to pick your battles. A good friend of mine says, every dollar you spend is a vote for how you want the world to be. When we spend money, it's the most obvious way of showing the world what we value. Now, for me, that means I often value takeaway coffee and the odd caramel slice. I value having drinks and time with friends of mine, but I'll go for the house Shiraz, you know, because I'm spending the money because I value the time with the people more than I do. Where I've got plenty of friends who'll get a very much smaller group and, you know, go for the Grange. Yeah. Picking your battles is a similar thing. If we want to be effective in our communications, then we need to think about what communications are worth having. Which messages do we want to share? So again, another one really quickly. I actually probably have a clicker somewhere. This one, and I'll be quick here too, is just a visual way of representing that same idea. That, you know, I thought I used water and wine. So some of us preach water, some of us preach wine, some of us do water, some of us do wine. Now, so for example, I'm using Trump as an example of somebody who preaches water, he does wine. Caligula preached wine, did wine. Mahatma Gandhi preached water, did water. I guess what we're all really aiming for in life, I think, is to be not on that axis. We don't want to be Trump, and we don't want to be the sheep in wolf's clothing. You know, that person who is threatening, but never follows through. The person who preaches wine, but does water. And I think we can see that the communications that came from, okay, like he was a crazy Roman emperor, but you knew how crazy he was. Like I could have put Hitler in there, or Mussolini, or, you know, Idi Amin. We could put anybody in that. But at the end of the day, you knew that what they said was what they were going to do. And there is a level of integrity in that. We don't want to be on that axis. So again, going back to that empathy map, sometimes actually thinking about that, where are the differences between what somebody says and what they do? How does that impact? What insights can I take out of that in relation to their integrity? The next one here, I'll be really quick again. Sorry, another flip, I feel like this is my own personal pointer. Again, I don't think I'll be very long here. Is you've heard me use this expression already. Communication is what the listener does. And I think the best example for a way of thinking about this, because I think if you take nothing else away from this, to effectively communicate, that you need to think more about the listener than anything else, I think that's where you will have benefits here. Now, I'm assuming that many of you are parents, or want to be parents, or have had a parent, or have dealt with a small child at some point in your life. Now, the customary wisdom with children is you should teach them to say please or thank you. Evidence of good parenting is that your children will be polite. They will say please or thank you. I want to take that one level further. I'm going to actually call bullshit on that particular piece of advice. Actually, what you want is for people to hear your child say please or thank you. And I used to say to my children over and over again, it doesn't matter whether you said it or not. What matters is whether I heard it. And in all communications, I think that is what's really important. It doesn't matter what your message is, it matters whether you hear it or not. So my next one here, click here. This is where I actually want to do a little exercise here. I'm not sure how it's going to work with such a small group. But actually, rather than do it with everybody, given that you know what it is that the people who put their hands up will do, would you and I might volunteer to do that, and we'll match here. Have you seen this exercise, Dee? The hands up exercise.
Yes.
Would you mind being the hands up person? And we'll, okay. So this will make no sense to any of you on the video until we do the otherwise. What we're just going to do is break away for a second. We'll just do them in these pairs. Yeah. What I'd like the people in the pair to do is to just tell us a story. Okay, and then just tell us as engaging a story as you can. We'll just do it for about something you're passionate about, how you got here, what the traffic was like, anything, doesn't matter. What you're going to do after we leave here, just tell us something. We'll go for about 30, we'll go for a minute, if that. We'll stop when you stop. But yeah, if you can, also we're going to do this as an effective communication, so if you can absolutely face the person that you're doing it with. So, no, you can't do it with me, I need to do it.
Oh, because you know it, of course.
We'll do it. No, you need to do it, we need, because you know each other, or no, we need somebody who knows.
Yep, you know.
There, that's good.
All
All right.
Is that right?
Yep. Yes, okay. So tell me a story.
Okay, can I tell you?
I was going for a run yesterday, and near my house today, there's a train tracks. And as I was running towards the train tracks, I could see
me and my partner
all the cars were backed up.
going to so we're doing some
Hundreds of meters down the road.
I mean, last
and then
night.
when I actually got to the train tracks, there's a space where the pedestrians can walk. And the train was going
on the train where you had
and just driving back
the
that
windows like on the roof so you can see while you're traveling along the mountains. My partner also really wants to see a bear catch salmon out of a river. So we're trying to work out an adventure to do with that. And then we were thinking about going to New York afterwards. So we feel that we might go and visit my friend who lives there at the moment, and then we go to like different restaurants and things. So we're just doing some Googling last night of some restaurants, and we're going to take a full month off.
Oh, sounds awesome.
So,
okay, I'm going to wind you up. So I'm going to wind you up. Oh, did you?
No, I was just after.
So starts having the conversation. Yeah,
sorry.
So, as somebody who's did your hands go up?
No.
Oh, they didn't go up at all.
Mine did.
Oh, wait, what? Yeah, I wonder why you did that.
Yeah, it's distracting, isn't it?
Yeah.
No hands was going up all the time.
Yeah.
And actually, we're having a great conversation. My hand went up a number of times. I'm going to explain why. So the instructions that we had is every time a little thought goes into your mind that's not directly involved in what this conversation is about, put our hands up. So just a signal.
Stop listening.
Now my hand must have got up about 25 times, particularly right at the very beginning, because I was thinking about now, are these guys doing it right? How are they all sorted? So I was, and it's not that I wasn't engaged in the conversation.
Yeah, well, I found when you said about the railway attacks, all of a sudden I remembered a situation where I had my dog on, and I was thinking of that day, and I was actually not thinking about your day anymore.
I was actually listening.
Yeah,
because that was really interesting, and I want to know what you're going to do.
You're annoyed about us stopping it now, aren't you?
We can feel it in the conversation. Now, I was listening to you too. I am fully engaged. The salmon, it's like immediately I thought, I need to write that down because that is a really good idea. And I've got a friend of mine who's working in Alberta at the moment, and that could, that was it wasn't that I wasn't engaged in the conversation. But again,
and that's the extrovert introvert too, because we think to talk. We talk to think. So we're wanting to talk and engage in it. So we're thinking when it's distracted. Plus the brain can go 500 words a minute.
Yeah, well, exactly. And that's, your brain is capable of listening to or taking in twice as many words as you can speak, or that somebody else can speak. So while you are processing the words, now just think about how fast you read compared to how fast you listen. So if you're doing an audiobook will take you more than twice as long usually to listen to than it will take to read. And I'm a slow reader. Lawyers are notoriously slow readers because we've been trained to pick out every single word, not the nuance of the whole thing. So think about how much stuff is going on in your brain. Just because there's other stuff that's going on in the listener's brain doesn't mean that they're not listening to you. In fact, if they really are listening to you and not using the time to think about what they're going to say next in an exchange, they should be making connections between their own lives and what it is that you're saying. The problem happens when listeners do that to the point where it's completely obvious to the listener, to the speaker, that they are processing their own thing. So sometimes that extrovert-introvert conversations can be really difficult because an introvert will be sitting there processing it all, thinking about it seriously, really focusing on what matters to them, but not necessarily putting the same effort into signalling that listening.
And especially when we say that body language. So, although one of the things I really liked that I heard the other just recently was that you can learn all these ways to show that you're paying attention, to nod and if you're actually paying attention, you don't have to do any of that because you're actually paying attention.
Well, in fact, on the guide there is
showing how you're paying attention
instead of listening.
And on the guide that I've got at the end of the packs includes that Celeste Handley TED Talk that in fact you put me on to, which I just love because it just resonated so many of the things I say myself. It's just like, if you have to look like you're paying attention, then clearly you're not paying attention. Like focus less on how to look like you're paying attention, which actually brings me to the next thing. But just as we sort of flow that through, how did it feel when I kept putting my hand up?
Well, I didn't really know what was going on, so I was like, no, I'm just going to keep talking.
Because initially you seemed a little bit thrown by it, like it was just...
Yeah, because I was thinking, what the hell are you doing?
Again, so you can get distracted when you're doing the speaking too.
Yeah.
And so this is, this little model here actually comes from a friend of mine who works at William Angliss and who teaches international students to serve people in hotels. So people who come from a range of different cultures. Now I've changed it. Her model is called Simple. She says it's simple. You need to smile, demonstrate some interest, mirror their body language. I'm like, don't like that. Be present, listen, and she says emphasize their name. I say empathize. I say carry that little map in your mind. But I think ultimately any communication, a simple model like this works. Firstly, actually sign on and engage in the communication that you're in. Be 100% there. Now, in a face-to-face communication, that could be as simple as smiling at somebody, as doing or returning their smile, reacting to them, being present, looking at them, as opposed to looking at your phone or your computer screen. One of the things that I do, and it's changed my life, is when I get on the phone to somebody in a work context, I turn my chair around, or these days I don't sit, I stand, I turn my back to my computer screen. How many times have you been on a phone call with somebody and you're aware that somebody's reading an email at the same time? Because we can do that. We are smart. Our brains are incredibly powerful. But if you can do something that you can listen at the same time, fair enough. Taking notes of the conversation, you're actually actively involved in the conversation. They're the same thing. But reading somebody else's email and listening, that's multitasking. It's moving very quickly between one thing and another. So sign on to the conversation, even if you're on the phone, or even, should I suggest, if you're on an email or text message. So I rang somebody the other day and they said to me, I started talking about something and they said, now come on, you're returning my text message, we're going to talk about my stuff first. And I said, no, I'm not. He looked and he said, oh no, I never said that. I'm like, how much ADHD do you have to not actually be able to finish a text message that you've started? Like, sign on, do it, absolutely engage in it. Showing interest in what the other person is doing. I prefer the word curious than interest. Be curious about where a conversation or a communication is going. Again, having an effective plan doesn't mean, or a plan to be effective doesn't mean that you need to have a plan with no deviations from it. Be curious about where the conversation could go or the communication could go, whether that's in a written format or whether it's in writing. Particularly when we're talking to each other, be present. I know I'm kind of saying the same thing over and over again. Partly it's to fit my little model. I think simple is a good anagram. The thing that should be in a bubble bigger than everything else is listen. Listen with your eyes, listen with your ears, listen with intent to really empathise, to understand. And by empathise, I don't mean pity somebody. I don't mean feel sorry for somebody. I don't mean to work out what they should do if they were you. I mean to understand where they're coming from in this moment and to be generous enough to work out whether actually this is a conversation you need to move on or escalate to somewhere else. This is the best that they can do, then maybe this is a conversation that means that they need to go somewhere else. So Brené Brown's examples of using this model, where she talks particularly to people in the army about problematic people that they work with, and says, well, if we have empathy and generosity, if this is the best that this person can do, the number of people who just show relief and say, well, actually that means it's time for them to move on. I can only work with people to a point. If this is really the best that they can do, and I know that with integrity that I've done as much for this person as I can do, then actually the generous thing is to move them on to another role or into another place. That can be a really hard and confronting thing to do, but when it's done with empathy and understanding, and a good lawyer, then you should be fine. I'm going to move on to the next slide now again. So again, I know, as I said, we need to rush it along, but there are so many different types of communications and so many different ways to be effective. One of the ones that I think many of us, particularly people who are moving from a stage where they're being mentored to mentoring themselves, feedback can be one of the most difficult things to think about. And it seems to me that the model can be pretty simple. That ultimately there are 4 general types of feedback that we get. We get constructive feedback or destructive feedback. So feedback that's constructive helps us work out what to change or to make decisions about whether or not we're in the right place. Destructive feedback is the stuff that makes us smaller, the stuff that has us second guessing ourselves or starting to agree with the inner critic that's in most sane people's heads all the time. And again, to the other axis here is there's negative feedback, feedback about improvement, and the one that's actually hardest to get, positive feedback.
Hardest to get or take?
Hardest to get. Hardest to, it can be the hardest to remember to give.
Yeah.
Now, and maybe this is, I'll give you some context here. I don't like to use the word academic, I call it pracademic. I'm a pracademic now. I get to read university master's level essays and judge them, give them a mark. I have to give them a grade. So that is a feedback. Just the grade by itself is feedback. If you are a law student, you've probably spent your entire life being in the top of the class. You might be slightly mathematically challenged. That seems to happen with a lot of them. And they don't seem to realise that if you're in a room of 100 people who have all been in the top 10% of their class their entire lives up till now, statistically, it's more likely that you won't be than you will be. That maths doesn't work for them. The number of times I hear, but I've never got anything lower than a HD or an A. I get it a lot. But what's really interesting is particularly those kids who are good at school, they might be crap at a lot of things, but they're good at school. They've been good at school their whole lives. They very rarely have a lot of insight into why they're good at school. They know what's on the test. When they get something wrong on the test, they will go and work that out so they never get that thing wrong again. But they very rarely have a lot of insight or opportunity to get insight into why they do something well. And as a person giving feedback, it's hard to tell somebody that they did something badly, but those of us who are sane humans, who want our businesses and our lives to work and want to live with integrity, think seriously about ways to do that, to help that person to be constructive. But it's easy to tell somebody you did a great job. It's harder and feels unnecessary to take the time to tell them why or what was good about what they did. And actually, that's the best kind of feedback. It's hard to do and it's hard to ask for because it feels really needy, doesn't it? To say, thanks, I'm loving all this positive feedback, but I'd really like to understand exactly what it is. You know, the Net Promoter Scores, for example, they don't help us with that. You know, we're all chasing a great Net Promoter Score that says, yes, you are likely to recommend my goods and services to your colleagues, but getting the why is much harder. So again, sometimes in organisations we value what we can measure and we tend to measure what's easy to measure. So again, going back to integrity and thinking about communication, thinking about that constructive feedback, I think is really important. And I guess, so with constructive feedback, it's a no because. And constructive positive feedback is a yes and, or a yes why. Also, being generous enough to think that somebody who is good can still be better, without that becoming a criticism, thinking about it from an integrity point of view of, this is great, where can you take that next? Also often means, okay, I'm at risk of losing a good employee because they're going to want to do something better, but you know, you live a long time. So again, simple model for thinking about it, but before you're giving feedback or when you're asking for it, to think about framing to have an effective conversation about feedback, I think is really valuable. Next one. I don't think we can talk about effective communications without talking a little bit about small talk. And small talk is the stuff that actually can be really hard, particularly for introverts to do. And some people feel that they need to have an effective way of being able to walk into a room and do small talk. Now again, it's something that I don't know that we've ever been able to unpick. There are, rules that you'll hear. Don't talk about sex, politics, or religion. Okay, they're probably relatively good rules, but sometimes sex, politics, and religion are the most interesting things about somebody. And if we're going to go back to my earlier model, which is we want to be effective in a communication, and in order to do that, we need to sign on and demonstrate interest. If all we're going to do is talk about the football or the weather or the traffic on the way that we're here, we need to kind of trust ourselves to have a conversation. My husband is an introvert, but he's also a performer. So he's a musician and he stands on stage all the time. So he can do the big rooms and be on show. But he doesn't like large groups of people. He gets his energy from one-on-one conversation. So how he manages his big room is he finds questions to ask that get people talking about themselves. And he learns such interesting stories. So he never asks, what do you do? He asks, what do you like doing? Or what's the best thing about your job? Or what was the most interesting thing that happened to you yesterday? Or something like that. Now he can kind of get away with that because of the way that he deals with it, and he's got integrity. I don't think there is a formula for small talk, but I can provide you a kind of framework for what small talk shouldn't be. So my x-axis there is the amount of time that you are likely to spend doing this kind of talking, and my y-axis goes to, are you well meant when you're doing it, or are you coming to it from a place that doesn't have integrity and is not well meant? So if your motivation is not well meant, it's more, but you're doing it quite a lot, or you're seeing it quite a lot, it's more likely to be gossip. So small talk, and I would always caution against gossip, basically. Yes, water cooler conversations, as they call them in America, are valuable. Walking around your site, walking around your office, and having conversations with somebody helps develop relationships that ultimately provide the foundations for ongoing, for effective communication. And yes, how are you today is a greeting, not an inquiry. You often need something more than that. But if the first place you go to is, let me tell you a story about Susan, that's not the kind of small talk I would suggest that you look for. And, you know, and you go from idle gossip through to trash talk, basically, to just bagging somebody for no reason. I guess the other side of the seldom, we go somewhere from really small talk to we add intimacy along the way. So if you think about, I guess intimacy might be another way of thinking about that time bar. But yeah, you can sort of go all the way through to talking dirty, I guess. You have to find the place on that bar with well-meant small talk that suits your integrity and that's appropriate for your audience. So one of Kath's made-up models, which not sure how you think about it. So let's move in quite along. Another place where we need to communicate a lot and think about effective communications is meetings. Meetings like this one, which are...
What time is it?
It's now 15:15 and we've got a hard deadline at 12:30.
Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone have to go.
Are we all good? Basically Seth Godin, many of you all heard about, worth looking at some of his blogs if you're interested in this stuff, particularly around how creativity works in organisations. He says there are basically only 3 types of meetings that you have. There are meetings where you're imparting information, there are meetings where you are looking for a discussion, and there are meetings where you are looking for permission to do something, where one party goes in looking really to get agreement so that they can do something, or that the other person will do something for them in some way. Essentially the advice there is really going right back to the beginning, thinking about what is the effect of the meeting is the same as thinking about what's the effect of the communication. If we think about communication as being something that the listener does, then we need to think about when we're going to those meetings, how can we communicate information? How can we facilitate discussion? How can we be clear about the permissions or the agreements that we need? Godin's advice would be don't mix them up. Have different meetings for different things. We can't always control that. I think actually it's more commercial advice to be aware when it is that you're seeking each of those things. Be aware, use your empathy map to think about what's the other person looking for here. Also, drawing a bit from Seth Godin's work, I think it's also worth thinking about the different kind of questions that we ask, particularly in meetings. You can tell I'm an MBA, can't you? I love a diagram, an X and Y axis. Again here, on my X axis, I think of this as how much you already know or how invested you are in the outcome when you ask a question, from none to lots. And on my Y-axis is how much information you actually want. Now, it seems to me that the more you're invested in finding out information, the better the question you're going to ask is. So you're asking questions there that are designed to elicit information. So what we're trying to do is, a good question will be a leading question. It will be a yes and question. It will be a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer, that isn't able to be planned on a decision tree in advance. But if we're going in where actually our question is really a statement, where we're asking questions that are designed to drive somebody to a particular outcome,
Can I just ask
we should be aware of it. Please.
One of the things we had in Queensland this week was someone a mentee, a female mentee who is in technology, and she was saying that she will go into, and she's a business development manager. She's very technically savvy, but the assumption is that she's not.
Oh.
So the assumption is that if there is a guy with her, that he will be the person who has the technical experience, or if there's not a guy with her, that she may not. So I was thinking about, and she's been on my mind, because she sort of just asked the question, what do I do? And I sort of just...
So that's a good example where a question that's designed to demonstrate your intelligence is a good idea.
Yeah.
Now, or your knowledge of the matter.
Yeah.
So again, it needs to be done with integrity and respect on the whole, because otherwise you're backing people into a corner.
Yeah.
I have so many stories about those, because being the young woman in the room 30 years ago when there weren't so many, and being asked to make the tea and do all of those bits and pieces, which I would quite happily do, I must admit. But actually being able to frame, and also working with the others. I think it's okay to have that's not okay conversation with a colleague afterwards,
or
when they take
to
over.
use this to ask a question that might elicit the fact that she's sharing her position, or she's sharing some experiences.
And I think it's, again, this is about effective communication, is about thinking about what the impact of the communication wants to be is. And questions are a way of communicating. And sometimes we forget about the bit in the bottom of that grid. I am racing now. This is my last one. So this comes from some work by Robert Greene, which is some of that old-fashioned work, I call it, from the 70s, where we were getting to guests and it was all about the power dynamics in conversations and blah, blah, blah. In fact, his book is called The 48 Laws of Power, and not really my cup of tea, I will say. But I do think, and this is for the oversharers amongst us, this one's for you, Aileen. But actually, sometimes we communicate how much power or influence we have by saying less. And that on the whole, these rules around, these thinking about, do I want to have this fight? Particularly for women, being hesitant in an argument is worse than saying nothing at all and finding a way to follow up subsequently. Because if you're sitting there, particularly those of us who are peacekeepers and who are wanting to weigh up all of the options, being hesitant, or the word that we all hate, saying sorry early on, diminishes your power in a conversation and diminishes the effect. I learned this great thing from my daughter fairly recently. I might have actually shared this with you over the phone, I'm not sure. I am a great one for saying sorry. I'm sorry I'm late. Sorry about the weather. I apologise for things I have absolutely no control over. And it's almost a verbal tick. It's not unusual, particularly for women of my age. I'm seeing that it's, it's a peacekeeping statement, whatever. My daughter pointed it out to me and says, don't say sorry, you actually mean thank you. You actually think about ways to reframe that, like, thank you for coming even though it's pouring with rain. Thank you for waiting for me, as opposed to sorry I'm late. This tiny little flip, thinking about the times when it automatic, and because sorry diminishes your power, thank you increases your generosity. So, or other people's perception of your generosity. Now, again, I'm not going to suggest anybody does anything that doesn't sit with their integrity, ever, because it's like pretending you're paying attention. It doesn't, it's not effective, even if all I'm trying to do is achieve effectiveness. But be aware of these kind of dynamics, and be aware of how it plays in the room when you're with somebody who's got more power than you. So Green says that the more you talk, the more interchangeable and ordinary your arguments will seem. I think that's the case if you're not a talker. With other people, it will show as enthusiasm. With other people, it will show as not letting anybody else get a word in. So I had, oh yes, and the last thing I wanted to say here is, and we've talked about this, is the medium is the message. And sometimes having to think about, actually, is this a conversation I should be having face-to-face, or should I be putting in writing? Or more likely these days, isn't it time I got off my chair and spoke to that person rather than send an email? Or isn't it time that I use my voice instead of a text message? That's because when we communicate personally, we give so much more of ourselves to that communication. And it is significantly more effective for the relationships. And so the last thing I was going to do is a little exercise again, but we really don't have time and I don't think it'll translate. So I might just explain this exercise and challenge you, if you've got some homework, to try and do it in your own organisation. One of the hardest things to communicate is a leadership message or a mission message. Particularly those of you who have your own businesses or who are leading or managing a team. So what we do in this exercise is I ask you to write down on one post-it note. In the exercise we write it down twice, but one post-it note will be enough, of your key leadership message, whether it's the mission that you have for your team in a particular situation, or just something as simple as, I think good leadership is blah, blah, blah. This is what good leadership looks like. Or in the context of this, we might have used here, an effective communication is blah, blah, blah. And then what we do with this exercise is you hand over your post-it notes to me, and I mark them, and each of you goes and says to somebody else one-on-one, I'm Cathryn Nolan. I think effective communication is what the listener does. I might fill that out a little bit. And then I say that to Sarah, and we swap around. And Sarah will say, I work for Cathryn Nolan. My name's Sarah and I work for Cathryn Nolan. And she says effective communication is blah, blah, blah. She's going to repeat the message, whatever that is. It's going to sound a little bit like Chinese whispers now. We're going to do it again. So, I'm Dee. I work for Sarah. Sarah works for Cathryn Nolan. In our organisation, blah, blah, blah. We go right around. Do it 7 times, ideally. We don't even have enough people in the room to do it. And then I will call Cathryn Nolan. I've got the mission statement on my ticket, and I will find what Cathryn Nolan's, who here in this room is a minion who works for a minion, who works for a manager, who works for a senior manager, who works for a director, who works for Cathryn Nolan, and they will stick their hand up maybe. Often they'll get lost. There'll be somebody who's like, oh, I don't know. We've lost that name in our trail along the way, because it often does get lost. And then they will repeat the message and we'll see how similar it is. Remember that when we communicate, and the point is, because they're very rarely, unless you're very practiced at it, and if I just gone ahead there, chances are my message would have been okay, because we're a small group. You have heard me say effective communication relies on what the listener does. You would have heard those names, we could have repeated them. But basically the science shows us that particularly with leadership messages, particularly with value messages, you need to hear them about 10 times before they sink in. So as leaders, we need to think really carefully about that language. Now, what happens often is we get our mission statements, we get our 5 words. They always say integrity, yay. We use design thinking, we treat our people well, we care about the environment. I don't know, we've got those words. But what they mean and how we communicate them is actually really important. And you've got to remember, communication happens down the line. And it really is what the listener does. So it's a great exercise to do with a larger amount of people. It actually is really quite fun. And I would strongly recommend you have a go at it. But you can do it secretly. That's the beautiful thing, again, from design thinking. You can prototype these things. Try a leadership message. Write it down somewhere and put it on a post-it note and hide it under your desk. Talk to a few people about it. Ask them if they'll talk to some other people about it. See where it starts coming back to you. Count how long it takes. Again, design thinking, we can talk about that some other time, is about iterating and prototyping, because it's about testing how do we do the right thing for us. And I think that's pretty close to where I'm finished. Oh yeah, this is too messy. But I did want to point out that a lot of these things, we're really not making them up. That there is a whole lot of science that's being done at the moment about the way that our brains work. It's changing all of the time. And so actually thinking about other people and using empathy and the way that their brains work is really helpful. There's a nice little HBR article that I have got at the very end. There's some questions, but I'll just bring up that very last slide so that you can see that any of this stuff that interests you, all of the stuff that I haven't just made up as I've gone along and drawn on my experience, you should be able to access to find out a little bit more about it. And I'm sure Aileen will share the slides with you, or Dee will share the slides.
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll put those up on our Dropbox.
So that's...
Yeah, the Celeste.
Sorry, I got to go.
That's all right. No, we got started later too. So, thank you so much, and thank you for organising to make this available to people who are not in the room, which is the majority of our people.
Communications need to be effective. We have to work with the medium that we have, and that hopefully it'll work for them.
Yeah.